England, 1863. The gallows rose against a grey November sky, skeletal and indifferent to the rain that fell in torrents upon the assembled crowd. Victoria Hargrove stood upon the wooden platform, her feet bare against the weathered boards, the hemp rope coarse against her throat. The executioner stood to her right, his face obscured beneath a hood of black cloth, waiting for the signal that would seal her fate. Her heart thundered behind her ribs with an intensity that seemed impossible, as though her body did not yet comprehend that this was not some nightmare from which she would wake, gasping and trembling in the safety of a bed. The crowd below numbered perhaps 200 souls. Mostly they were indifferent figures, labourers seeking spectacle, merchant wives wrapped in dark furs, street children who had climbed onto one another's shoulders for a better view. Few had known the name Victoria Hargrove before the trial. Fewer still cared about the details of her supposed crime. What mattered was the ceremony, the ritual, the confirmation that justice, however flawed, had been served. She had been accused of poisoning Thomas Whitmore, her tutor and guardian. The charge itself was secured by bribery and perjury. The evidence they paraded in court was a contrivance. Yet the sin that gnawed at her ribs was simpler and darker. She had indeed measured the arsenic, had indeed watched the spoon vanish into his cup, and then hesitated. Whitmore, sensing rebellion, turned first. He laced her tea, and then bought the verdict. What damned her at law was false. What troubled her conscience was not. Her mind drifted to Margaret, her elder sister. Margaret, who had married a baronet with considerable estates and an even more considerable bank account. Margaret, who had smiled with genuine warmth when their parents were alive, but whose countenance had transformed entirely once their father's financial ruin became public knowledge. The day the debts were called in, the day the creditors began their vulture's descent upon their townhouse, Margaret had sent a single note. It contained no words of comfort, no offer of asylum, only a brief message. I cannot afford association with scandal. I hope you understand. She had understood. She understood that love in the upper reaches of society was a currency exchanged only when it proved profitable. A commotion erupted from the street beyond the gallows. The crowd's attention shifted momentarily, heads turning in unison toward the disturbance. A carriage approached, black lacquered wood gleaming despite the rain, the Northwick ducal seal emblazoned upon its door in silver. The horses were magnificent creatures, their coats dark as midnight, their movements precise and controlled. Even the guards who flanked the cart seemed to pale at its approach, their vigilance slackening. Victoria's breath caught. Julian Warwick, Duke of Northwick, was a man whose very name commanded deference throughout England. She had heard the whispers in drawing rooms before her fall, stories of his impenetrable demeanour, his coldness, his absolute control over every matter within his vast domain. She had never seen him, had only observed sketches in newspapers, and heard descriptions from society matrons. Nothing could have prepared her for the moment when the carriage door opened and he emerged. He was tall, impossibly so, his shoulders broad beneath the fine tailoring of his coat. His hair was the colour of dark chestnuts, swept back from a face of aristocratic precision. But it was his eyes that held her, grey-green, piercing, regarding the scene before him with an expression of utter detachment, as though the impending execution were merely another item on his day's agenda, no more significant than a meeting with his steward or a response to correspondence. For a moment, the two of them locked gazes across the distance that separated the platform from the street. Victoria felt something shift within her chest, some calculation occurring in the depths of her mind. This man owed her nothing. He knew nothing of her. Yet there existed in that brief exchange something that transcended explanation, a moment where possibilities seemed to converge and crystallize into desperate hope. The executioner placed his hand upon her shoulder, a signal that the final moments had arrived. The crowd quieted. The rain continued its relentless descent. The hangman's knot bit, then, miraculously, gave. Not by providence, by purchase. The executioner's apprentice, eyes lowered, had left the coil imperfect, as instructed. A shout rose from the rear of the crowd. Two draymen collided, spilling a crate of bottles that burst like musket fire, another detail arranged and paid for. Victoria dropped, the rope slipping, and she struck the boards and rolled. The Duke had not moved. He merely inclined his head, the smallest of permissions. "Drive," he said, and the team leapt as if the word were a whip. It was only then that Victoria noticed the older man positioned in the far corner of the carriage, a gentleman whose face had gone quite pale, whose expression suggested profound shock and dawning horror at the circumstances that now surrounded them. This, she realized, must be Henry Crowley, the steward whom the Duke mentioned. "Your Grace," Henry began, his voice trembling with barely suppressed outrage. "This is quite inappropriate. We must return to the authorities immediately. This woman is a condemned prisoner. We cannot possibly—" The Duke raised a single hand, and Henry's protest died unfinished. "I find myself remarkably disinterested in what is appropriate, Henry. Continue toward Northwick House. Ensure we avoid the main roads. But, Your Grace, your concern for propriety is noted and dismissed. Drive onward." Victoria remained frozen, mud still coating her skin, watching as the most powerful man in England chose to ignore every convention that dictated he should return her to the gallows from which she had escaped. She had no idea why he had done this. She understood only that for the first time since her condemnation, she possessed something she had believed lost forever. She possessed tomorrow. The Northwick townhouse stood as a monument to old wealth and older power, its grey stone facade rising 5 stories toward a sky that promised further rain. The interior reflected generations of accumulated privilege, marble floors that gleamed beneath the light of crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of ancestors whose names had long since faded into irrelevance, furnishings that represented the pinnacle of craftsmanship and expense. It was into this world of refined austerity that Victoria Hargrove was delivered, still covered in the mud and filth of her escape. The carriage had traversed the darkening streets of London with deliberate intention, avoiding the main thoroughfares where constables might be posted or search parties assembled. Henry Crowley had maintained an expression of profound disapproval throughout the journey, his face growing increasingly pale, as the reality of the Duke's unprecedented decision seemed to crystallize within his consciousness. When the vehicle finally came to rest in the circular drive before the mansion, Henry moved to exit with visible agitation. The Duke emerged first, his movements unhurried despite the gathering tension. He extended a hand to assist Victoria, though she barely comprehended the gesture, her mind still locked within the shock of continued existence. The moment her feet touched the gravelled drive, Henry began to voice his objections. "Your Grace, this is extraordinarily irregular. This woman is a condemned criminal. I must insist that we contact the authorities immediately. Whatever your intentions, they cannot possibly supersede the requirements of law and propriety. The scandal alone would be catastrophic. Your reputation, the dignity of this household, all will be compromised by this extraordinary lapse in judgment." The Duke listened without interrupting, his grey-green eyes fixed upon Henry with an expression of calm assessment. When Henry finally ceased speaking, breathing heavily from the exertion of his protest, Julian turned toward his longtime confidant with the measured deliberation of a man accustomed to having his authority accepted without question. "Henry, your concern for propriety has been noted. However, I find myself remarkably indifferent to your objections. You have served this family admirably for nearly 2 decades, and that service has earned you considerable latitude in matters of estate management and household administration. It has not, however, granted you authority over my personal decisions. If you choose to leave this residence this evening, I will not prevent your departure. However, I would caution you that circumstances surrounding your departure might prove somewhat complicated. It would be unfortunate were you to be perceived as having harboured a condemned prisoner, would it not? Such associations might generate questions regarding your own involvement, your knowledge, your possible complicity. These questions would prove thoroughly unpleasant to address, I imagine. The implication hung between them like a physical thing, dense and suffocating. Henry's face drained of remaining colour, his jaw working silently as the implications of the Duke's words crystallized within his understanding. He was being offered an unambiguous choice: remain silent or face destruction. The calculus was brutally simple. "I see that you comprehend the situation," the Duke continued, his voice carrying neither malice nor triumph. Your discretion in this matter will be appreciated. Your continued service, even in this peculiar circumstance, will be remembered as an example of your profound loyalty. Henry's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining from his frame. He was a man accustomed to clarity, to the uncomplicated execution of well-established protocols. This situation offered no such comfort. Yet he also understood the fundamental reality that opposed him. The Duke of Northwick could not be defied. "Very good, Your Grace," Henry said quietly. "I shall ensure the arrangements are made." "Excellent. I require that Miss Hargrove be provided with appropriate accommodations on the 3rd floor. Old Thomas will assume responsibility for her requirements. Ensure that no member of the household staff below stairs becomes aware of her presence. Those who require knowledge of the situation will receive instruction directly from myself. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Grace. Perfectly understood." The Duke turned his attention toward Victoria, who remained standing in the gathering darkness, still mud-covered and dishevelled, her form casting an incongruous silhouette against the elegant stone of the mansion. "You will remain here. Your immediate needs include bathing and appropriate clothing. Thomas will provide both. You will not leave the residence. You will not communicate with any member of the household staff. You will not draw attention of any variety whatsoever. These restrictions are not negotiable. Do you comprehend?" Victoria nodded, finding her voice with difficulty. "Yes, Your Grace, I understand." "Admirable. Henry, ensure that arrangements are made." The interior of the mansion seemed to close around Victoria, as she was escorted upward by a weathered man she would later learn was indeed old Thomas, a servant in his 60s whose grey whiskers and stooped posture suggested decades of service within the household. He spoke minimally as he guided her through corridors lined with portraits and landscapes, past doorways opening onto rooms of evident luxury and carefully maintained disorder. Their destination was a suite of apartments on the 3rd floor, removed from the primary inhabited spaces of the house. The chambers were spacious and elegantly appointed. A sitting room provided access to a bedchamber beyond, complete with furnishings of considerable quality and refinement. The bed itself was draped in pale blue silk, and the windows looked out over the darkened garden beyond the mansion's confines. It was a prison rendered in velvet and fine materials, no less confining for its aesthetic superiority. "His Grace has instructed that water be provided for your ablutions," Thomas said, gesturing toward a screen behind which a bathing apparatus had been constructed. "I have been informed that garments of an appropriate size will be delivered within the hour. You are to remain in these apartments. You are not to leave for any reason. You are not to contact any member of the household. His Grace will provide further instruction as necessary." "Why?" Victoria asked, the word escaping before she could consider its wisdom. "Why has the Duke done this? I am nothing to him. He risks everything, his reputation, his position, by harbouring me." Thomas regarded her with an expression that might have been compassion or merely professional detachment. It was impossible to determine which. "Miss, I have served the household for 38 years. I have observed the Duke since his childhood. I have learned that his Grace's motivations are rarely simple, and his decisions, however unconventional, are invariably calculated to achieve a specific objective. Beyond that, I cannot speak. I am instructed only to ensure your basic requirements are met and to maintain absolute discretion regarding your presence." "Moo!" He withdrew, leaving Victoria alone in the chamber with only her confusion and her desperate gratitude for continued existence. The water was hot and welcome. As Victoria bathed, she observed the mud flowing from her skin in dark rivulets, the filth of her escape dissolving into steam and warmth. She examined herself in the mirror afterward, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes carrying the peculiar intensity of someone who had stood upon the threshold between existence and oblivion. She scarcely recognized the woman reflected back at her. Within the hour, as Thomas had promised, garments were delivered. Simple cotton gowns, chemises, stockings, all of appropriate size, though of notably inferior quality compared to the furnishings of the apartment. She dressed in the silence of the chamber, awareness settling upon her slowly, like sediment in still water. Officially, Victoria Hargrove was dead. The newspapers would have reported the execution. Her family would receive confirmation of her demise. The world believed her to be beyond life, beyond consequence, beyond reach. That evening, as darkness fully descended upon London and the household settled into its nocturnal rhythms, Victoria ventured cautiously into the sitting room. Through the partially open door, she heard voices ascending from somewhere within the mansion. The Duke and Henry, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. She positioned herself where she could hear without being observed, her breath held to ensure silence. "The documents have been delivered, as requested," Henry was saying. "But Your Grace, I must urge caution. If this becomes known, it will not become known," the Duke replied. His voice carried absolute certainty. "The authorities will eventually conclude that the execution proceeded as recorded. The prisoner was removed from the apparatus, they will determine, but was recaptured in the forest beyond the gallows. An accident resulted in her death. The body was claimed by the parish and buried in an unmarked grave. These details will be accepted because they will originate from sources the authorities trust implicitly. And you believe such fabrication will suffice? I believe it will suffice because truth is remarkably mutable, Henry. Most people will never question the official record. Those few who might harbour doubts will find themselves unable to articulate their suspicions in any fashion that would generate investigation. The magistrate himself will be disinclined toward further scrutiny." Victoria's breath caught. The Duke knew something. He possessed knowledge regarding her case that transcended mere sympathy for a condemned prisoner. The certainty in his voice, the specific details of his knowledge, suggested familiarity with the corruption that had secured her false conviction. Before she could hear further exchange, Thomas appeared in the corridor below, his presence causing both men to cease their conversation. Victoria withdrew quickly, returning to the bedchamber before her presence could be discovered. But the questions that now occupied her mind provided no comfort. Why did the Duke know so much about her case? Why had he been present at her execution? What objective could he possibly pursue through her salvation? She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the darkness beyond the glass, aware that she had escaped one prison only to enter another. The gallows awaited no longer, but neither did freedom. She existed in a peculiar liminal space, neither fully alive nor entirely secure, suspended in the Duke's mysterious protection for reasons she could not yet fathom. In the study below, the Duke reviewed documents by candlelight, his expression grave and distant. Henry had withdrawn to his own chambers, his objections overruled, if not truly accepted. Julian Warwick sat alone with his secrets and his knowledge, aware that the decision he had made in that moment of impulse would cascade through his existence in ways he could neither predict nor entirely control. Yet he did not regret it. For the first time in 5 years, since Catherine's death had frozen his capacity for feeling, something within his chest had stirred in response to another human being's desperation. It was a sensation he did not entirely trust, yet it was also a sensation he could not deny. The first 2 days of Victoria's confinement unfolded in silence so profound that she began to question whether her escape had been merely a fever dream, whether she remained truly upon that platform, the rope tightening around her throat. The apartments on the 3rd floor became her entire world. She moved from bedchamber to sitting room, observing the fine furnishings with an awareness that they belonged to someone else's existence, not hers. The windows overlooked gardens that were beginning their descent into winter's harshness, trees bare and skeletal against a perpetually grey sky. She did not attempt escape. Where would she go? Every constable in London carried a description. Every magistrate sought her capture. The gallows awaited any soul who returned her to their custody. The Duke did not visit. This fact troubled her more profoundly than she could articulate. He had saved her at extraordinary personal risk, yet he abandoned her to isolation immediately thereafter. Was she to be forgotten? Was this merely an extended form of execution, death by slow dissolution rather than by rope? On the morning of the 3rd day, a knock upon her chamber door announced the arrival of a young woman bearing a breakfast tray. The girl could not have been more than 19, with dark hair pinned beneath a white cap, and eyes that reflected genuine curiosity beneath the trained neutrality of household service. "I am Sophie, miss," she said, her voice soft and carefully modulated. "I have been instructed to bring your meals and attend to any requirements you might possess." Victoria studied the girl, aware that here existed a potential source of information. How long have you served in this household? 3 years, miss. I came from a small village in Surrey when I was but 16 years of age. The household offered opportunity I could not have obtained elsewhere. Has the Duke always been this residence's sole occupant? I noticed the chambers seem somewhat uninhabited. Sophie hesitated, her training warring with her natural inclination toward conversation. The Duke maintains other properties, miss. He divides his time among them. This townhouse has been occupied less frequently since the Duchess passed away, 5 years prior. The mention of a Duchess startled Victoria. He was married? Yes, miss. The Duchess Catherine. A beautiful lady, from all accounts. The household still feels her absence, or so I have been told by those who served during her lifetime. Sophie departed before Victoria could pose further questions, but the revelation had settled within her consciousness, like a stone dropped into still water. The Duke was a widower. He had loved someone, been loved in return, and lost her. This knowledge transformed him from an abstract figure of authority into someone more comprehensibly human. Yet, it did not explain his actions. She attempted to occupy herself with the books she found upon the sitting room shelves. They provided some solace, volumes of poetry, philosophical treatises, novels of varying merit. In another life, she might have spent days absorbed in their contents. Now she read only passages before restlessness compelled her to rise and pace the confined space once more. On the evening of the third day, as darkness settled beyond the windows and the household seemed to quiet into its nocturnal rhythms, the Duke finally came. Julian Warwick entered without announcement, his appearance suggesting he had only recently concluded his formal business of the day. He wore an unadorned dark coat, his cravat loosened slightly, his hair bearing the subtle disarray of fingers combed through it during moments of concentration. He regarded Victoria with an expression of careful assessment, as though cataloguing every detail of her appearance. "You have recovered somewhat from your ordeal," he observed, his voice carrying that familiar quality of absolute certainty. "Your Grace, Victoria found herself uncertain how to articulate the confusion that had occupied her mind for 72 hours. "I do not understand why you have done this. I am nothing to you, a condemned prisoner. You risk tremendous consequence by harbouring me. Sit, Miss Hargrove. We have considerable ground to cover, and your posture suggests the exhaustion of confusion." Victoria lowered herself onto the settee with the careful movements of someone uncertain of her own physical reality. The Duke positioned himself in a chair opposite, maintaining the formal distance that propriety demanded whilst they remained unchaperoned. "Tell me about your relationship with Thomas Whitmore," he said without preamble. "Describe precisely what occurred in the days preceding your arrest." The directness of his questioning caught her unprepared. She had anticipated expressions of concern, perhaps inquiries into her feelings or her health. Instead, he demanded specifics about her case with the precision of someone who required particular details for understood purposes. "I lived in his household," she began slowly. "My parents died 6 years ago. My sister, she married and rejected me when the family's circumstances became compromised. My brother, when he was alive, had made provisions within the law to ensure I would have a guardian. Whitmore was selected, though I suspect the compensation involved was insufficient to generate genuine interest in my welfare." "Proceed." "He was a difficult man, unpredictable in his moods. He maintained expectations that went beyond those typically associated with a tutor's responsibilities. When I refused his advances, he became increasingly hostile. Several months ago, I attempted to poison him." The confession emerged without conscious deliberation. Her own words seemed to belong to someone else, some other version of Victoria inhabiting this moment. The Duke's expression did not alter. "You attempted to poison him. How?" "I placed arsenic in his evening tea. I believed if he died, I would be freed from his guardianship. I knew it was sinful. I knew it was murder. I was willing to accept the consequences of my action. Yet the poison was ineffective. He survived. He claimed I had attempted to kill him and produced evidence supporting the accusation. I was arrested within days." The Duke rose from his chair and moved toward the window, his back to Victoria, his posture suggesting profound concentration. When he spoke, his voice carried neither judgment nor approval. "You did not receive a fair trial, Miss Hargrove. The judge who presided over your case is corrupt. He accepted payment from Whitmore in exchange for ensuring a guilty verdict. The evidence presented was fabricated or misrepresented. The witnesses called upon to testify were coached or coerced. You were condemned not because of guilt, but because Whitmore required your elimination. Victoria felt her breath catch. Then you knew. You knew I was innocent before you saved me. I became aware of the corruption within your trial after the fact, though I possess knowledge of Whitmore that predates your arrest. He is not a man of principle. He is not a man of conscience. He is a predator who identified you as vulnerable and exploited that vulnerability. When circumstances failed to eliminate you through legal mechanisms, he sought alternative solutions. But why were you present at the execution? How did you know to be there? The Duke turned from the window, and for a moment, Victoria glimpsed something within his expression that suggested profound emotion, carefully restrained beneath layers of aristocratic control. I became aware of the execution date through certain contacts. I intended to observe and then pursue private channels to overturn the verdict. Instead, I witnessed your escape and recognized it as a more expedient solution than legal proceedings would have provided. I did not come to observe your death, Miss Hargrove. I came because the courts move at a pace that buries the innocent. The only remedy left was an indecent one. What will become of me? You will remain in these apartments. You will not leave this residence under any circumstance. You will not attempt communication with anyone beyond these walls. You will not reveal your presence to any member of the household staff. In exchange, I will ensure that your existence remains undiscovered and that eventual resolution of your situation is obtained through means that will not compromise either of us. And what do you expect in return? The Duke returned to his seat, his grey-green eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her carefully maintained composure. I expect your absolute compliance with my instructions. I expect your discretion. And I expect that you will answer whatever questions I choose to pose regarding your circumstances, your history, and your understanding of the events that have transpired. You are asking me to trust you. I am not asking, Miss Hargrove. I am informing you of the terms under which you will reside within this household. The alternative is quite obvious. You may refuse these terms and present yourself to the authorities. I assume you comprehend which option is preferable. Victoria nodded, though compliance felt far more complex than mere physical acknowledgement. She had escaped death only to enter into dependence upon a man whose motivations remained entirely opaque to her understanding. Yet, as she observed the Duke's composed features, something within her shifted. Whatever his reasons for saving her, he possessed power sufficient to protect her. That was, perhaps, the only certainty available in her current circumstances. The Duke rose to depart. At the threshold, he paused, turning back toward her with an expression that suggested something approximating concern, though his voice remained characteristically measured. You will find that the household staff has been instructed to attend to your basic requirements. Sophie will be your primary contact. Should you require anything of significance, you may communicate through her. You will not leave these apartments. Do you understand? Yes, Your Grace. I understand perfectly. After his departure, Victoria remained seated in the gathering darkness of the sitting room, her mind occupied by the revelation that her salvation had been achieved not through chance or mercy, but through the Duke's deliberate knowledge of her innocence and his willingness to defy legal authority in pursuit of what he considered justice. She existed within his protection now, bound by gratitude and dependence in equal measure. What would eventually be required of her in exchange for this protection, she could not yet determine. She could only wait and watch and attempt to comprehend the mysterious motivations of Julian Warwick, Duke of Northwick. The garden beyond the windows had transformed into Julian's sanctuary, a place where the rigid architecture of the household could be momentarily abandoned in favour of something approaching genuine solitude. It was here, during the twilight hours when daylight surrendered to evening's gathering shadows, that Victoria discovered her captor to be something far more complicated than she had initially comprehended. The week that followed her confession in the sitting room unfolded in a pattern that seemed almost choreographed, though neither of them acknowledged the deliberate arrangement of these meetings. Julian would arrive each evening as the servants moved about their duties in distant corridors, their presence reduced to the peripheral awareness of routine activity. He would escort Victoria through the mansion's labyrinthine passages to a series of glass structures where exotic plants flourished despite the encroaching London winter. Palms created towering canopies, their fronds casting intricate shadows across the stone pathways. Flowering vines climbed the glass walls, releasing fragrances that seemed to belong to warmer climates, more forgiving seasons. Their conversations began superficially, discussions of literature, of philosophy, of the world beyond the mansion's confines. Victoria discovered that the Duke possessed an education far exceeding what society typically demanded of even the most accomplished gentleman. He questioned her regarding her own studies, and she found herself admitting to knowledge of Greek classical texts, translations she had undertaken during her years with her parents before their financial collapse. "You read the ancients in their original language," Julian observed one evening, his tone suggesting something between approval and surprise. They stood beneath the glass canopy, surrounded by the gentle susurration of water moving through hidden channels that created miniature fountains throughout the garden. "That is exceptional for a woman of your circumstances." "My father believed that intellect transcended gender," Victoria replied, acutely aware that she was engaging in conversation with the man who had orchestrated her salvation, speaking with him as though they inhabited a world where such dialogue was normative rather than extraordinary. "He provided instruction to all his children, regardless of their sex. My brother received the same tutors I did. My sister dismissed it all when she married, determined to cultivate the appearance of feminine delicacy that society demanded." "Your sister rejected you." The statement emerged without inquiry, as though Julian had concluded this truth through observation and deduction, rather than direct disclosure. Victoria turned away from him, observing her reflection in the glass panes surrounding them. She appeared ghostly in the fading light, translucent and insubstantial. "She rejected our family's reduced circumstances," Victoria corrected quietly. "I merely happened to be part of that rejection." Julian's silence stretched between them, companionable in its own way, until he spoke again. "Come with me. There is something I wish to show you." He led her from the glass garden, through corridors she had not previously explored. The paintings that lined the walls grew progressively more refined, more carefully positioned, more clearly treasured. They arrived at a smaller gallery where portraits occupied places of particular prominence. One in particular captured Victoria's attention, a young woman with fair hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to follow the viewer's movement with uncomfortable awareness. She was perhaps 25 in the painting, dressed in pale blue silk, her expression suggesting both contentment and an underlying complexity that conventional portraiture rarely attempted to capture. "Catherine," Julian said, and the name emerged with a particular quality of voice that made it clear he rarely spoke it aloud. "My wife. She died 5 years ago." Victoria examined the portrait with the careful attention one extended to objects of acknowledged significance. There was something in Catherine's features that reminded her of herself, an intensity in the eyes, perhaps, or a certain set to the shoulders suggesting an internal landscape of greater depth than society typically attributed to women. "She was beautiful," Victoria offered, aware that the observation was inadequate, but uncertain what else propriety allowed. "She was intelligent, spirited. She possessed opinions regarding matters that society insisted women should politely ignore. She was..." Julian paused, and in that pause, Victoria glimpsed something raw in his expression, something that suggested his carefully maintained composure concealed depths of genuine feeling. "She was murdered." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Victoria found herself unable to formulate any response that seemed adequate to the revelation. "Her death was attributed to illness," Julian continued, his voice carrying a flatness that suggested he had delivered this explanation many times, to many people, each iteration requiring greater effort to maintain emotional distance. The physicians concluded pneumonia. The reality was considerably more sinister. Catherine had formed an attachment to another man. When she attempted to end that attachment, he responded by poisoning her. It occurred over several weeks, administered in small quantities designed to suggest natural decline rather than deliberate harm. "How did you..." Victoria began, but Julian raised a hand, gesturing her toward a bench positioned before the portrait. "I knew of the attachment. I observed it developing. I waited for her confession. for acknowledgement that would have allowed me to address the situation with decisiveness. Instead, I chose inaction, believing that confrontation would merely exacerbate matters. My hesitation cost her life. The man who poisoned her was never apprehended. He disappeared into the continent, and I lacked sufficient evidence to pursue him across borders. I have spent 5 years in the aftermath of that failure. Victoria understood then, with devastating clarity, the true nature of Julian's obsession with protection. It was not love that had motivated his rescue of her. It was guilt transformed into a desperate need to prevent another tragedy, to demonstrate through action what he had failed to demonstrate through attention when it might have mattered. "I am not her," Victoria said quietly. "No, you are not. Yet you see something of her in me." Julian turned from the portrait to regard Victoria directly, and in that moment, his carefully constructed mask seemed to slip, revealing the man beneath, not a duke, not a figure of absolute authority, but someone burdened by the weight of choices unmade and consequences that could never be undone. I see someone who requires protection, someone whom society has attempted to destroy through mechanisms of law and corruption, someone whose intelligence and resilience suggest a capacity to survive circumstances that would devastate others. Whether these qualities mirror Catherine's remains irrelevant. What matters is that I find myself unable to permit your destruction. That evening, as they walked through the glass garden with darkness fully descending beyond the glass walls, Julian's hand brushed against the loosened strands of Victoria's hair where they had escaped their restraining pins. It was not an accidental touch. She understood this with absolute certainty. Yet neither acknowledged it directly. Instead, they continued walking, their hands remaining in proximity without quite achieving contact, the space between them charged with an awareness that transcended their circumstances. The moment shattered when Henry appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, though his presence clearly intentional. The cough he emitted seemed unnecessarily pronounced, a deliberate interruption that emphasized his disapproval of whatever the Duke and Miss Hargrove might have been engaging in within the privacy of the glass garden. Julian stepped away from Victoria with the precision of someone accustomed to maintaining appropriate distance, though his expression suggested considerable internal conflict regarding this requirement. The evening ended as it had so many others, with separation, with the return to their isolated chambers, with the accumulation of unspoken feelings that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Victoria lay awake that night, unable to reconcile the man she had initially feared with the man she was discovering him to be. Julian Warwick was not her saviour in any redemptive sense. He was a man seeking redemption through her salvation, attempting to absolve guilt that might never diminish regardless of his actions. Yet as she contemplated this understanding, she recognized that her own motivations had become equally complicated. She remained within these apartments not merely because escape was impossible, but because she found herself reluctant to depart, reluctant to abandon whatever was beginning to form between them. Fragile and undefined though it remained. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a courier whose urgency suggested matters of considerable significance. Henry received it in the entrance hall, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to genuine concern as he reviewed its contents. Victoria observed this exchange from her position near the library doorway, where she had positioned herself to catch glimpses of household activity without revealing her continued presence within the residence. That evening, Julian summoned her to his study rather than arranging one of their customary walks through the glass garden. The deviation from established pattern unsettled her immediately. His expression as she entered suggested the weight of decisions made and consequences contemplated. Investigations have been initiated regarding inconsistencies in the execution records from the day of your supposed death, Julian informed her without preamble. Someone has questioned the documentation. The authorities have begun inquiries into the matter. It is not yet a crisis, but it will become one if we do not act with appropriate deliberation. Victoria felt her breath catch. What will you do? I will do what I have always done when circumstances demand it. I will manipulate those mechanisms of power that remain within my influence. The magistrate who oversees such inquiries owes me considerable favours. The clerk responsible for maintaining execution records can be persuaded towards selective amnesia regarding specific details. The constables assigned to investigate will discover their inquiries lead toward conclusions that support the official narrative. You would corrupt the machinery of justice itself. Justice is already corrupted, Miss Hargrove. Your condemnation proved that beyond any reasonable doubt. I am merely redirecting existing corruption toward an outcome that serves truth rather than obscuring it. Henry appeared at the doorway, his expression carefully composed, though his eyes betrayed considerable internal conflict. Your Grace, the documents have been prepared as you requested. However, I must express grave concern regarding the potential consequences should these fabrications be discovered. They will not be discovered, Henry. They are sufficiently subtle to withstand casual examination, and no one possessing the authority to conduct rigorous investigation would consider it worthwhile to do so. You may instruct the clerk to proceed with implementation. After Henry's departure, Victoria found herself advancing toward Julian with a directness that surprised them both. You are placing yourself in extraordinary jeopardy for me. You are risking everything, your position, your reputation, your very liberty. Why? What possible justification exists for these actions? Julian rose from behind his desk, moving toward the window with the deliberate movements of someone requiring distance before responding. Because I have spent 5 years attempting to undo a single moment of inaction. 5 years watching men and women navigate their lives with the freedom I permitted to be stolen from them. 5 years consumed by guilt and impotence. When I observed your carriage approaching the gallows, when I comprehended that another death would occur because of my failure to act decisively, I understood that I could not repeat that particular catastrophe. That is not about me, Victoria said quietly. That is about Catherine. Julian turned to face her, and in that moment, the controlled facade he maintained so carefully seemed to fracture, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. Yes, it is about Catherine. It is about a woman I failed to protect because I was too cowardly to confront the circumstances of her affair. It is about poison administered slowly, methodically, while I sat in my study reviewing correspondence and financial reports. It is about my complete and utter inability to save someone I loved. You cannot save me by corrupting everything you claim to believe in. Cannot I? Or do I simply lack the capacity to distinguish between salvation and possession? I have asked myself this question repeatedly, Miss Hargrove. I do not possess a satisfactory answer. What I know is that I find myself unable to permit your destruction. Whether that constitutes genuine concern for your welfare or merely obsessive repetition of my failure with Catherine, I cannot definitively determine. The honesty of his confession, the raw vulnerability in his admission of uncertainty, seemed to dissolve the careful boundaries Victoria had maintained between gratitude and something far more dangerous. She crossed the space, separating them without conscious deliberation, her hands rising to frame his face, and she kissed him. It was not a delicate gesture or a tentative exploration. It was an act of absolute commitment, a declaration that transcended the complicated circumstances of their situation and the moral ambiguities surrounding his actions. For a moment, Julian seemed frozen, unable to process the reality of her initiative. Then his arms encircled her waist, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened with an intensity that suggested months of restraint finally finding release. The sharp sound of a throat being deliberately cleared shattered the moment. Henry stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, though his presence clearly intentional. The interruption was not accidental. His appearance at this particular moment possessed all the markers of calculated intervention. Julian and Victoria separated with the awkwardness of people rediscovering the importance of propriety. Henry's face remained carefully neutral, though his eyes reflected unmistakable disapproval. Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. However, the matter regarding the execution documents requires your immediate attention. The clerk has encountered complications with implementation. The remainder of that evening dissolved into discussion of practical concerns, how to address the complications without attracting unwanted scrutiny, how to ensure that the fabricated documents would withstand potential examination, how to manage the investigation such that it concluded with acceptable conclusions. Yet beneath these practical discussions, something had fundamentally altered between Julian and Victoria. The moment of physical connection, brief though it had been, had transcended all the previous complexity and uncertainty. It had established a reality that neither could subsequently deny or diminish. Victoria returned to her apartments that night with her thoughts entirely consumed by the sensation of his arms around her, the taste of him, the overwhelming sense of being truly seen by another person for the first time in her existence. She understood that his motivations remained tangled with guilt and obsession, that his need to protect her was inextricably bound to his failure to protect Catherine. Yet she also understood that something genuine had begun to develop between them, something that transcended both his psychological need for redemption and her desperate gratitude for salvation. The following days proved increasingly complicated as Julian navigated the machinery of investigation and misdirection. Victoria learned from Sophie's careful comments that constables were pursuing various leads, that the magistrate involved possessed considerable influence over the direction of inquiry, that the official narrative was gradually solidifying into an acceptable conclusion. Ashworth's involvement remained obscured, the corruption that had secured her conviction relegated to the background where it would eventually be forgotten. Yet with each passing day, Victoria became increasingly aware of the precariousness of her situation. She remained confined to the Northwick townhouse, unable to venture beyond its walls without risking discovery. Her official death had been accepted by society, reported in newspapers, acknowledged by those who had attended the execution. To emerge into the world would raise questions that could not satisfactorily be answered without exposing Julian to catastrophic consequences. She was free from the gallows, only to remain imprisoned within these walls, dependent upon a man whose affection was tangled with obsession, whose protection was motivated by guilt as much as by genuine concern for her welfare. Yet as she contemplated these realities during the long hours of isolation, she recognized that she possessed no desire to escape. The risk Julian undertook for her protection had transformed her understanding of what devotion might accomplish. The morning that would alter the delicate balance of their carefully constructed existence arrived without warning or ceremony. Henry discovered them in the library, Victoria and Julian standing far closer than propriety permitted, her hand resting upon the spine of a leather-bound volume he had drawn from the shelves, his fingers positioned mere inches from hers. The moment was innocent in its technical execution, yet the intimacy conveyed through proximity transcended the boundaries of acceptable conduct. Henry's expression transformed from shock to something far more complicated, a blend of disapproval, understanding, and genuine concern for the catastrophic consequences such a discovery might precipitate. He withdrew without acknowledgement, his retreat calculated to avoid witnessing further intimacy. Yet his departure carried within it an unmistakable message. The situation had become untenable. The secret that had been maintained through careful management and strategic deception now possessed a witness whose discretion could no longer be guaranteed through threats alone. That evening, Julian summoned Henry to his study, with the formality of a man preparing for confrontation he anticipated would prove devastating. The older man entered with shoulders drawn tight, his expression suggesting he had spent the intervening hours contemplating the implications of what he had observed. "You will now present me with your ultimatum," Julian said, gesturing Henry toward a chair positioned before his desk. "You will inform me that my conduct is unconscionable, that harboring a condemned prisoner has progressed beyond mere transgression into active corruption of justice. You will suggest that disclosure of these circumstances would be both within your rights and necessary for the preservation of your own conscience. Please, proceed with whatever denunciation you have prepared." Henry remained standing, his posture reflecting the internal conflict consuming him. "Your Grace, I have served this household for nearly 2 decades. I have maintained your secrets, managed your affairs, and devoted myself entirely to the preservation of your interests and reputation. Yet I find myself unable to countenance this particular course of action. What you have done, what you are doing, extends beyond the boundaries of acceptable conduct, even for a man of your station, and yet you have not departed this residence. You have not contacted the authorities. You remain here, witnessing my transgressions, aware of my corruption, yet taking no action to prevent further deterioration of circumstances. Because I recognize that your Grace acts from motivations I comprehend more thoroughly than I might wish. You are attempting to absolve yourself of guilt through the salvation of this woman. You are attempting to undo Catherine's death by preventing this one. Yet in doing so, you risk destroying everything: your title, your position, your very liberty, and she will be destroyed alongside you. Julian moved from behind his desk to stand before Henry, his expression carrying neither defensiveness nor arrogance. What do you propose? That you release her? That you permit her to disappear into the continent or some other location where her survival would be assured, but where her presence would not endanger you? That you allow yourself to move forward from Catherine's death rather than remaining shackled by guilt? I cannot do that. Then what, Your Grace? What possible resolution exists for this situation that does not culminate in mutual destruction? Julian extended a hand toward Henry, and the gesture carried within it an offering that transcended the formal relationship between master and servant. I propose that you remain, not as my steward bound by threats and manipulation, but as someone who comprehends the reality of my actions and chooses to remain nonetheless. I propose that we navigate this circumstance together, that your loyalty is repaid through honesty regarding my intentions and your involvement in resolving the complications that my decisions have created. Henry's eyes glistened, emotion threatening the careful composure he had maintained throughout their interaction. Your Grace is asking me to become complicit in corruption and deception. I am asking you to become my partner in a cause you understand to be just, even if the mechanisms through which we pursue that justice are morally compromised. I am asking whether your loyalty extends beyond the boundaries of propriety into the realm of genuine commitment to my welfare and to the welfare of a woman whose only crime was refusing a predator's advances. For a long moment, Henry remained silent, wrestling with the choice before him. Finally, he lowered himself into the chair Julian had offered. I will need explicit assurance that you have considered the potential consequences. I will need to understand precisely what you intend regarding Miss Hargrove's future. And I will require that you acknowledge the burden you are placing upon my conscience. All of these things I grant freely. They planned with meticulous attention to detail, developing strategies designed to misdirect investigation and solidify the narrative of Victoria's successful execution. Documents were prepared, officials were contacted, and mechanisms were set in motion that would support the conclusion authorities had already begun to accept. Yet despite these careful preparations, the flaw in their construction revealed itself with devastating abruptness. On a Thursday afternoon, constables arrived at the Northwick townhouse, bearing a magistrate's warrant, authorizing thorough search of the premises. The investigation that had seemed to be concluding in an acceptably convenient manner had apparently encountered complications. Questions had been raised regarding inconsistencies in testimony. Someone had suggested that perhaps the execution had not proceeded as officially recorded. Julian responded with the composure his position demanded. He granted the authorities complete access to the residence, directing them toward whatever areas they deemed necessary to examine. Yet as the constables moved through the mansion, Victoria remained concealed in the library's secret compartment, a narrow chamber constructed decades earlier during political upheaval, designed originally to protect Julian's mother during dangerous times. The space was suffocating, dark, containing only a small quantity of fresh air channeled through carefully concealed apertures. The narrow chamber had been cut a generation earlier, when safer allegiances required stone to keep a woman silent while men shouted in the streets. She remained there for 24 hours while the search proceeded and concluded. The constables found nothing to support their suspicions. The residence contained no evidence of harboured prisoners, no signs of deception beyond the ordinary mechanisms through which aristocrats conducted their private affairs. After thorough examination, they withdrew, their investigation apparently satisfied that the official narrative remained reliable. When Julian finally opened the compartment's hidden door, Victoria emerged dishevelled and traumatized, her hands trembling, her breathing emerging in shallow gasps. He gathered her into his arms, and she collapsed against him with complete surrender to the emotion that had accumulated during those interminable hours of isolation and fear. I cannot continue this existence, she whispered, her voice raw and fractured. I cannot remain imprisoned indefinitely. I have escaped the gallows only to enter a different form of death, yet I cannot depart either, because doing so would destroy you. I find myself trapped between the necessity of my own survival and the impossible choice of preserving yours. I love you. God forgive me, but I love you entirely. I would accept whatever consequences result from that confession. Julian held her in the gathering darkness of the library, surrounded by volumes containing the accumulated wisdom of centuries, yet powerless to articulate a response adequate to her declaration. His silence extended between them like an abyss, neither condemnation nor affirmation, merely the profound absence of words sufficient to encompass the reality they now inhabited together. The revelation arrived not through official channels or magistrate announcements, but through the careful cultivation of information that Henry had begun to accumulate during his weeks of active participation in Victoria's protection. Judge Ashworth's corruption did not emerge in connection with Victoria's case specifically. Instead, a parallel investigation into multiple falsified convictions across several years had uncovered a systematic pattern of bribery, fabricated evidence, and deliberately compromised verdicts. Ashworth had transformed the magistrate's bench into a mechanism for generating personal wealth, accepting payment from wealthy criminals seeking to eliminate competitors or unwanted witnesses. The scope of the investigation expanded rapidly once initial irregularities were discovered. Authorities began examining dozens of cases that had proceeded through Ashworth's courtroom. Among these were the trials of individuals who had been condemned through mechanisms identical to those that had secured Victoria's conviction. One case in particular attracted significant attention. A woman accused of attempting to poison her guardian, the evidence provided by that very guardian himself, the judgment rendered with suspicious rapidity and certainty. Victoria's name appeared in the revised investigation files, noted among Ashworth's documented victims. The case was flagged for potential reversal, the conviction marked as potentially unjust, the circumstances surrounding her supposed execution suddenly scrutinized with renewed intensity. Yet simultaneously, this development created complications that neither Julian nor Henry had fully anticipated. Her case was no longer merely a private matter requiring careful management through fabricated documents and strategic misdirection. It had become public record, subject to official review and potential exposure. Henry arrived at Julian's study with documents that bore the seal of the magistrate's office, his expression suggesting both triumph and profound anxiety regarding what these official papers represented. Your Grace, the investigation has concluded its preliminary examination. Judge Ashworth has been formally charged with corruption spanning a period of nearly 7 years. 47 cases have been identified as potentially compromised by his conduct. Miss Hargrove's case is among those designated for immediate review and reversal of verdict. Julian reviewed the documents with careful attention, understanding that vindication for Victoria carried consequences he had not entirely anticipated. The execution is now documented as questionable. More than questionable, Your Grace. The records indicate that inconsistencies in the official documentation have drawn scrutiny. The clerk who prepared the execution records has been interviewed and is now cooperating with authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. He has acknowledged that certain details regarding the execution were added retroactively based upon instructions provided through intermediaries. Our intermediaries. Yes, Your Grace, our fabrications have become apparent. However, the investigation's focus remains upon Ashworth and his established pattern of corruption. The irregularities in Victoria's case documentation are being attributed to Ashworth's attempt to destroy evidence of his misconduct, not to external interference. The official narrative is being accepted by those conducting the review. Victoria's legal vindication arrived with remarkable rapidity once the investigation's conclusions were formally documented. She was posthumously absolved of all charges, her conviction declared null and void, her status officially altered from guilty prisoner to innocent victim of judicial corruption. The newspapers reported the investigation's findings with the sensationalism they reserved for stories involving the downfall of men in positions of authority. Judge Ashworth was arrested, his accumulated wealth seized, his reputation destroyed entirely within days. The Home Office memorandum did not resurrect her, it merely untied the knot. Judgment quashed, execution record irregular, identity of subject not conclusively established. The law erased its own line, then left a blank space where her name should have been. A blank a marriage could fill. They removed to Northwick House in Sussex, where the chapel kept its own weather and the servants spoke in hedgerow vowels. London would have made a spectacle of them. The country would lend them silence. A blank space where her name should have been. Yet the resolution of her case legally created new complications of far greater magnitude. Victoria remained officially dead. Her execution had been reported to every newspaper, recorded in public documents, acknowledged by society as concluded. To emerge publicly would require explanation for her survival that could not be articulated without exposing Julian to catastrophic legal consequences. She possessed freedom in the technical sense. She had been exonerated of all charges, yet she remained imprisoned by the very vindication that had freed her from legal culpability. It was during these circumstances that Henry brought to Julian a proposal that had begun to develop within his mind during the months of their collaboration. Henry's presentation was formal, carefully constructed, delivered in the study where so much of their fate had been determined by decisions made beneath pressure and necessity. Your Grace, I have given considerable thought to Miss Hargrove's situation. Her legal exoneration is complete and absolute. Judge Ashworth's corruption has been thoroughly established. Yet she remains trapped by the circumstance of her official death. Society cannot accommodate her resurrection without questions that cannot satisfactorily be answered. She cannot reclaim her life as Victoria Hargrove, condemned prisoner. She cannot re-enter society under her own identity. Yet she also cannot remain indefinitely confined within this residence. You are suggesting removal to the continent. I am suggesting something far more practical, Your Grace. I am suggesting that Miss Hargrove's official death be accepted, but her resurrection be accomplished through legitimate means. I am suggesting marriage. Julian understood immediately what Henry was proposing. A marriage between the Duke of Northwick and a woman whose identity would be established through her union with him would accomplish what no other mechanism could achieve. Her past would become irrelevant. Her previous existence would be absorbed into a new identity as Duchess. The scandal that would inevitably accompany revelation of her origins could be managed through the combined authority of Julian's position and Henry's careful management of information flow. You are suggesting that I marry her. I am suggesting that marriage provides the only mechanism through which she can exist in society without remaining perpetually imprisoned. It is not a matter of romance, Your Grace. It is a matter of practical necessity. As Duchess, she becomes a figure of consequence and authority. Society will not scrutinize her origins when she occupies the highest social position available to a woman. She will be free. You will preserve her from further harm through legitimate social mechanism, rather than through corruption and deception. Julian considered this proposal with the deliberation such a suggestion demanded. Marriage had seemed a distant possibility, something that might occur in the distant future after they had resolved more immediate complications. Henry was suggesting that marriage represent the solution, rather than merely one potential outcome. Yet the logic was undeniable. Legitimacy through marriage was a mechanism that society understood and accepted, regardless of the circumstances that had preceded it. That evening, Julian presented the proposal to Victoria without embellishment or romantic language. He approached it as Henry had, as a practical solution to an impossible situation, rather than as an expression of emotional commitment. Henry suggests that marriage represents the only viable mechanism through which you might reclaim any semblance of normal existence. As my wife, your identity becomes established through our union. Your past becomes irrelevant because your present becomes defined by your position. Society accepts such arrangements without requiring detailed explanation of origins or previous circumstances. I am offering this to you not as an expression of love, though that element now exists alongside all other considerations. I am offering this because it represents the only solution that preserves both your welfare and my capacity to protect you through legitimate rather than illegal mechanisms. Victoria regarded him with an expression of profound complexity. You are asking me to marry you based upon practical necessity rather than upon romantic inclination. I am informing you of the reality that marriage represents. Romance is a luxury we can perhaps afford in the future should we prove fortunate enough to achieve it. What I am offering now is freedom, legitimate status, and the protection that my position provides. Whether that evolves into something resembling conventional love remains yet to be determined. Victoria rose from her chair and moved toward him without hesitation, closing the distance between them. She took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the familiarity of repeated contact and acknowledged affection. Then I accept your proposal, not as a solution to my circumstances, though it certainly represents that. I accept it because I have discovered that I possess a far deeper attachment to you than mere gratitude or obligation permits me to rationalize away. Whatever our future holds, I wish to inhabit it alongside you. The chapel at Northwick House had not witnessed a wedding ceremony in 30 years. The space was intimate rather than grand. Stone walls that had absorbed the prayers of generations. Windows of stained glass casting fragmented light across wooden pews worn smooth by decades of use. The guest list consisted only of those whose discretion was absolute and whose presence was essential. Henry stood as witness, his position within the ceremony acknowledging his transformation from observer of transgression into active participant in solution. The clergyman who performed the service was an elderly man whose discretion had been secured through substantial donation to his parish, and whose understanding of aristocratic necessity transcended conventional judgment. Victoria wore pale blue silk, simple and elegant, her dark blonde hair arranged with careful restraint. She stood beside Julian in the gathering light of late afternoon, and when the vows were exchanged, her voice carried steadiness that suggested acceptance rather than reluctance. Julian's responses emerged with the precision of someone accustomed to public declaration, though his hand gripped hers with intensity that suggested this moment carried significance beyond formal ritual. The ceremony concluded within an hour. No reception followed, no gathering of society to celebrate the union. Instead, they returned to the townhouse where Sophie and old Thomas received them with carefully neutral expressions, aware that something fundamental had shifted within the household structure and hierarchy. That evening, Julian escorted Victoria to the master bedchamber, a space he had not truly inhabited since Catherine's death, and they crossed the threshold together into whatever the future would hold. He did not rush toward physical intimacy. Instead, they sat before the fire, and Julian finally provided the complete truth he had withheld until this moment. The reason I did not testify at your trial was not cowardice regarding your specific circumstance, though my hesitation to act decisively has characterized my failures with Catherine and haunted me subsequently. It was political necessity. Testifying would have required revealing that I possessed personal knowledge of Thomas Whitmore, that I had been approached by him regarding matters I cannot fully disclose. Such revelation would have complicated other negotiations of considerable importance. I chose political advantage over your safety. I chose my position over another human being's life. Victoria absorbed this confession without immediate response. The honesty of his admission, the willingness to articulate choices made for reasons that were not noble or justified, created a moment of genuine connection that transcended the romantic idealization of marriage. I must confess my own complicity in moral compromise, Victoria replied, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. During the years I spent under Whitmore's guardianship, he provided the only human connection available to me. When he exploited that position, I confused gratitude with affection. I became emotionally dependent upon the very man who was destroying me. When I attempted to poison him, part of my motivation was not merely escape from his control, but also liberation from the confusion of feeling that bound me to him. I possessed guilt regarding this liberation. I felt shame that part of me welcomed the justification his death would provide. Julian rose and moved toward her, drawing her into his embrace without urgency or physical demand. You were isolated and vulnerable. You responded to circumstance in ways that human beings respond when deprived of genuine connection. You possess no culpability in that response. Your attempted escape was not murder. It was survival. They remained before the fire as darkness descended beyond the windows, their embrace providing comfort rather than passion. Their physical proximity serving as declaration of acceptance rather than expression of desire. When intimacy eventually occurred between them, it emerged without theatrical flourish or dramatic crescendo. Instead, it unfolded as the natural progression of two people discovering that genuine connection could exist between them, that vulnerability shared could create bonds stronger than passion expressed through physical mechanism alone. The morning brought them to consciousness not as transformed souls emerging into perfect union, but as two people who had accepted the reality of each other's damage and chosen to proceed nonetheless. They dressed and descended together to face the household as its new master and mistress, their union now established through both legal and intimate mechanism. 3 months later, Victoria entered a ballroom filled with London's most exclusive society. Adorned in diamonds and pale green silk, her introduction announced as the Duchess of Northwick. The whispers that rippled through the assembled crowd reflected genuine shock. Where had this woman emerged from? How had the notoriously reclusive Duke suddenly acquired a wife whose origins seemed entirely obscure? Yet the questions remained unasked because social convention dictated that the wife of a duke required no antecedent history beyond her union with him. Her position superseded any requirement for explanation. Henry circulated through the crowd, discreetly managing the narrative, his redemption acknowledged through his active participation in establishing Victoria's social legitimacy. When questions arose regarding her background, Henry provided vague but sufficient explanations regarding distant relations and family circumstances that precluded previous social participation. The story was accepted because the alternative, questioning the wife of the most powerful duke in England, was socially untenable. Victoria observed the ballroom with the awareness of someone who had stood at the threshold of death and chosen to live beyond it. The crystalline chandeliers, the orchestral music, the carefully choreographed interactions of aristocratic society, all of it seemed simultaneously significant and entirely superficial. She possessed knowledge of survival that these people could never truly comprehend. She carried scars that would never fully heal, trauma that would occasionally emerge unbidden in moments of unexpected vulnerability. Yet she also possessed something many of them did not: genuine connection to another person who comprehended her completely. Julian positioned himself near her throughout the evening, his presence providing both acknowledgement of their union and subtle assertion that she existed under his protection. When he drew her toward the dance floor, society observed with satisfaction that the Duke had chosen to elevate his new wife through public display of recognition. That she might have chosen to be there represented a thought that had not occurred to anyone present. As they moved through the steps of the dance, Victoria caught glimpses of their reflection in the ballroom's mirrors, a couple that appeared to society precisely as such couples were expected to appear, elegant and composed and entirely conventional. Yet she knew that beneath the silk and diamonds existed a reality far more complex and far more genuine than any performance of aristocratic propriety could encompass. They had not achieved happiness through romance or redemption through sacrifice. Instead, they had constructed something authentic from the wreckage of their respective failures, creating a union that acknowledged both its complications and its fundamental reality. The transformation was complete, not because Victoria had transcended her trauma, but because she had integrated it into her identity. She was no longer merely the condemned prisoner or the woman rescued from the gallows. She was the Duchess of Northwick, and within that identity existed all the contradictions and complexities of a woman who had survived circumstance that would have destroyed others. Julian remained the man who had failed to protect Catherine, but he was also the man who had chosen to protect Victoria despite the cost. They had not erased their pasts. They had simply chosen to inhabit their futures together, scarred and flawed and genuinely real.